We can use high availability to ensure that the service we are running will stay up even though a node fails. Let's say we have a client that interacts with the service over here. The client sends messages to the server, but if the server fails, then the client can no longer access the service. So what we can do is to place a high availability component in between. Let's call it HA. And we can have a number of servers instead. So the client is connected to the high availability component, and the high availability component is connected to each of the servers. So that's server 1, server 2, and server 3. Now, if the client wants to access the service, it first sends a message to the high availability component, which takes the message. It then sends on the request to one of the servers. Now, each of these servers is able to handle this request on its own, but the high availability component will send it to server 1 first, say. It takes the message, processes it, and returns the answer back. The high availability component then answers the client, and the client is happy. If, however, one of the servers is down, the following will happen. First, the high availability component will get the request. It will send it on to the first server, but then time goes by, and the high availability component uses a clock to measure the time. If a certain deadline is passed, the high availability component will give up on server 1 and send it to server 2 instead. Server 2 then takes the request, processes it, returns back, and the high availability component can answer the client. Now, notice that from the client's perspective, it only took longer to get the request, to get the response back, but it still did get the response back, which is the entire point of the high availability component. Now notice that now that the component has given up on server 1, the next time a request comes in, so let's get our clock back. The next time a request comes in, it won't send it to server 1 because it is now down. It will instead send it directly to, say, server 3, which handles it, returns the answer, and then back again to the client. Let's now look at a high availability component in action. Here we have an implementation of a high availability component in about 100 lines of code. First, we initialize the state of the high availability component, marking all the servers as active. Then we have the implementation itself. So let's start running. Let's set a breakpoint. Okay, so we first get into the component. We check if there is a new message from our client. There isn't. We do another round. Let's see if there is something happening now. Yes, so now we got a message from our client. We receive it. We then notice down what time the task started and what the deadline is to complete it. As we can see, the deadline is 5 seconds into the run. Now we'll go and send it to one of the enabled servers. We check each server and see if one is enabled. Yes, the first one is enabled, or number 0 is enabled. So we send the task to that server. And we check to see if the server is done. It isn't. And we check if the deadline has passed, and it hasn't. Then we go around, we see what happened this time. Is the server done processing the request? Yes, it is. we receive the answer and send it back to the client. And we're done with this iteration. Let's see what happens the next time around. No message from the client. Okay, so we got another message from the client. Let's see what happens now. Again, we send it to one of the servers. Let's send it to server number 0. We check to see if it's done. It isn't. We check to see if the deadline has passed. Now, in each iteration, we are going to check if the deadline has passed. And as you can see here, the current time, 1000, is approaching in on 1005. And as we continue to run, it gets closer and closer to the deadline. Now, as we pass the deadline, okay, so the deadline is now passed. Let's see what happens. Now, the high availability component disables the server and asks to send it to another enabled server. Now it will choose server number 1 and send it there instead. Let's now see what happens. We get back. We check to see if the server is done processing the request. It is. We receive the response and send it back to the client, who has been patiently waiting for the high availability component to resolve the command, which it did. Let's now hook up the high availability component to 2 services and test it out. So we'll start by adding 2 server components that runs our simple ping command or ping service. So that's the ping service. And we need to add the server socket. Let's call it server 0. We started. Let's test it out. Works. Okay, so let's add another one. The information here specifies where to find the software component, and the socket specifies where we can reach the service. So let's call this server 1. So that's it here. Let's start it up. It has started. Let's try it out. Server 1 works as well. Then we need to add a clock component for our high availability to take the time. Okay, it's up. Let's now finally add our high availability component. Let's enter in the information where it can find the code. Let's add our timeout value. Let's use 5 seconds for our timeout. And let's hook up all the sockets. First of all, we need the service to be available. So we create a socket called HA. Then we need to hook up all our services. This will be an array. It's called server 0 and server 1. And finally, we add our clock component. And the clock is called C1. Okay, that's it for all the connections. Let's start up the high availability component. It started, and let's try it out. So now we issue a ping to our HA component. And as you can see over here, the HA component received it, and it sent it to server 0. If we send it again, it sends it to server 1. And it keeps changing between them. If we now stop the first server, now eventually the first server will be contacted, and now the timeout runs. And when the timeout finished, our high availability component sent it to the other server that isn't down, which is server 1. So we still get the service availability. If you found this video interesting and would like to learn more, check out the book Foundations of Computer Science, available on Amazon.